Welcome to episode 56 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of the show at the show notes, which is www.7, so all spelled out, seven health.com/56.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. This week is another solo show with me covering a specific topic, and this week's topic is all about fluid intake and urination. So I remember when I was studying nutrition that we were told of the importance of water and the kind of fairly standard advice that everyone gets that people should be drinking 1.5 liters or 2 liters of water a day. But as part of this discussion, there was never really any talk about urination, about how often someone should be going, about what to do if someone was urinating like every hour or so when they were drinking 2 liters of water, or what to do if someone was urinating in the night. So it was about 5 years ago, Matt Stone, who's a health writer who's had a really big influence on me, he started writing a lot about urination and fluid intake. He was talking about things that I was seeing in practice, but not understanding why or what to do about them. And I started to apply some of his ideas, both with myself and with clients, and noticed real improvements and real changes. And since then, I've been really refining this more and more and working out what's the best way to get it right with clients. So on today's show, we're going to look at the purpose of urination and how it works, why hydration is important and what's involved, because it's not just about water or not just about fluids. We'll cover how often you should be urinating and what to do if you either aren't going enough or you're going too much, and also why that's happening. And we'll look at how food intake and stress can then be connected with urination and also nighttime urination. So this is something that on the surface you may think is rather benign or doesn't make much of a difference, but as I'll explain as we go through the show, someone's urination habits can be a real window into how well physiology is working and point towards certain processes, both either positive or negative, and just give us an idea of other things going on within the body. So to start with, let's start with the purpose of urination. If you look at the urinary system as a whole, which is also known as the renal system, it includes the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. And the urinary system has 4 main purposes. So it's to eliminate waste from the body, to regulate blood volume and blood pressure, to control levels of electrolytes and metabolites, and also to regulate blood pH. And these processes are controlled by different hormones, by your circuitry system, and also by your nervous system. And basically your body is assessing what is going on both internally and externally in your environment, and through different hormonal changes, through different changes in the system, it tells the kidneys to, say, retain more sodium, or to hold on to more fluids to impact your blood pressure, or to eliminate more urea in your urine. Whatever needs to happen based on the feedback that the body is getting, it then passes this information onto your urinary system. So how does this then work? So the kidneys have an extensive blood supply, and this is both from the renal arteries and also the renal veins. So that is blood coming directly from the heart to your kidneys, as well as blood that has been pumped all around the body and is now coming back through your kidneys on the way of returning to the heart. And the kidneys are a filtration system, and via this feedback of the body that I talked about, they decide what should be continuing to be circulating in the blood and what should be then removed. And the stuff that is going to be removed through the process within your kidneys is then turned into urine, and this urine then leaves your kidneys via the ureters and makes its way down to your bladder. And the urine is then stored within your bladder and is then subsequently expelled from the body, moving from the bladder through the urethra and then out of the body. So that is the basic physiology of how the renal system, the urinary system works. So let's have a look at the concept of hydration. So most people can probably remember from school that our bodies are 70 or 80% water, and there's really no denying the importance of water for life. And because of this, we are regularly told about the dangers of dehydration. We're also told to drink 8 cups of water a day or 2 liters of water a day or some other generic number. And I find that people are often blindly following this advice and often drinking a lot more. So how much water do you need to drink to stay hydrated? To start with, I want to look at what is hydration. And when most people think about what is hydration, water is the only part of the equation that they think of. And hydration is about water, but it's how water is used in the body, and this involves another couple of substances, namely electrolytes and also food energy. And to explain this, I'm going to look at how cells function, and I'm going to promise to keep this fairly simple. So starting with the fluids, or for the water, all the fluids in your body are mainly made up of water. And floating in these fluids are your cells, and your cells then have water surrounding them, but they also have water that they contain inside them. So this is water that they've taken up through their outer membrane, as well as water that they've also produced themselves as part of chemical interactions or reactions. So the fluids that you take in through drinking, through eating, through into your body, these then make up the fluids in your body. So things like blood, bile, gastric juice, saliva, cerebrospinal fluid, mucus, etc. All of these are fluid-containing substances within the body. And there's also then the fluids that is inside the cell. And so this is it's known as intracellular water, and the water or the fluids that you have in the cell also have a huge impact on how your cells function, and it's something that I'll come to within a minute. So as I said, you have fluids that are all throughout your body. Some of those are inside the cell, and the majority of them are outside of the cell in different fluids or in different substances. So the next substance that then has an effect on hydration is your body's electrolytes. And so electrolytes is probably a term you've heard of or associate maybe with exercise, or when people are sick and they've got vomiting or diarrhea, people want to get them to take some electrolytes because they know they're losing it and they know that they're going to be in trouble from losing this stuff. But electrolytes are substances that carry an electrical charge and are essential to life. So this electrical charge is particularly important for how our cells function. So these substances have a real affinity for and work directly with each and every cell in your body to support health. And electrolytes can be broken down into 2 categories. There are those that are mostly intracellular, and this means that they are found in much higher quantities inside of the cell rather than outside of the cell. And so the electrolytes that fall into this category are things like potassium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfate, and potassium is the one that is playing the biggest role here. You then have electrolytes that are mostly extracellular, and this means that you'll find some quantities inside of the cell, but the majority of their numbers are found in the fluid outside of the cell. And the electrolytes that are extracellular and fall into this category are sodium, calcium, chloride, and bicarbonate, with sodium playing the biggest role. So each of the electrolytes is either found in high amounts inside of the cell or in high amounts outside of the cell, but not both. The final substance that is then important as part of hydration is the energy from your food. So namely carbohydrates and fats. And when I've talked about and written about this previously, I've always talked about this final substance as being glucose. And this is because blood glucose levels and also glucose levels that are actually in your cell are really important here. But I would actually expand this idea out and say that while glucose is really important, it's not the only energy source of note. And What is more important, or what is important to understand as part of this energy with the cell, much like the water and the electrolytes, is there's the amount that is both extracellular and also the amount that is intracellular. And for the extracellular part here, we are mostly referring to what is in the blood more than in the other fluids. So what is the sugars that you've got in the blood? What is the triglycerides you've got in the blood? What is the energy sources that you've got in your blood? And then also the intracellular amounts. So this is the amounts that are inside your cells. And what we're concerned with here is how much of these substances have you got in those cells, but also how well are the cells able to turn that into energy. So how well is your cells able to turn the glucose into cellular energy, which is ATP, because that is also really important. So proper hydration is then about getting the right balance between water, electrolytes, and energy. And this is both intracellular and extracellular. And it's not just about water, because if all you do is focus on water and you do so in a rigid manner of I need to drink 2 liters a day, while you're then failing to account for the electrolytes or the energy intake or the cellular energy production, then you're going to get very mixed results. So to explain this better, let me give you an example of how dehydration can work in everyday life, and then how overhydration can actually happen. So let's imagine someone who is following what is known as the Western diet, the Western pattern diet, standard American diet. It's a diet that contains a higher percentage of food that has been eaten outside of the home, and where that food has been prepared by someone else. It probably contains more processed foods. There's probably more fizzy drinks, things like meat and cheese, and lots of, as I said, processed foods. And in this scenario, if we're looking at then the 3 different factors that can influence hydration, energy intake is going to be typically high or very high. Because of the food palatability and the refinement process, it means that a small amount of stomach space can account for a very high amount of calories. So the carbohydrates and the fat intake are going to be pretty high, so they're going to be getting good food energy. In terms of electrolytes, this can be also pretty high in this diet. So certain electrolytes like maybe magnesium are going to be on the low side, but if someone is eating a diet that contains dairy with lots of milk and cheese, there's meat in all of its guises, whether we're talking about very nice meat or more of the processed meat, if they're having soft drinks and other processed foods, they're going to be getting decent amounts of the rest of the electrolytes, or pretty much the rest of the electrolytes, particularly things like sodium and chloride. So in this case, you have 2 of the important substances for hydration, which is food energy and electrolytes being high. And this person, therefore, would need to be taking in decent amounts of water to then balance out these other 2 substances. And unfortunately, this often doesn't happen. So this means that this person is much more likely, if we're looking at their urination, to have very yellow urine or very dark urine. Their urination is probably going to be much stronger in terms of smell because it's made up much more of waste products. They're probably going to have much less frequency in terms of the urination because there's just not enough fluid coming through that can be used to then be flushing this stuff out. So an individual like this is more likely to have dehydration as a problem, and so they might be getting symptoms like a dry mouth, sticky mouth, sleepiness or tiredness, dry skin, headaches, constipation, dizziness or lightheadedness, or like possible muscle cramps or restless legs. And so in this instance, this person would do well to be increasing the amount of fluids that they're drinking and the water that they are drinking. But changing their diet to include, say, more fruits and vegetables and other foods that have a high water content that also include electrolytes would also be helpful here. And this isn't going to be just someone who eats this way all the time, because most people will vary with what they eat, with eating certain times have eating more like whole foods, and then having certain times of eating like not as well or more processed foods, or eating out of the home more often. And I know that this happens for me. There'll be times like if I'm going on a road trip and I'm having to drive for a long time or most of the day, like during these times, there'll be limited options for what I can eat. And I'll normally pick up some food at the same time as I'm like putting some petrol in the car. And when this happens, I'll invariably end up eating some fast food. And normally it'll be whatever is available at that particular stop. And I noticed that every time after I've had like a burger with some fries and a Coke, like for the rest of the day, my urine is much stronger shade of yellow. And this one meal can then significantly up the need that I have for water just because of the amount of like calorie density that food has in it, the amount of electrolytes, particularly things like sodium that it has in it, and just because that is then pushing up both the electrolytes and the calorie content, that my need for water on those days goes up. Or when I go back home to Australia at Christmas time, I normally spend a lot of time going to restaurants. And I know I've mentioned a lot with fast food in this little example, but really it's not just about fast food. I'd say it's really any food where it is like rich food that has been very well seasoned, which is most restaurant food. And so if I then am eating that kind of food and then I'm throwing in ample amounts of like beer or red wine and I keep this up for a couple of weeks, I really start to notice how much that changes my urination in terms of frequency and color. And this is pretty much the only time in my life where I'll ever experience restless leg syndrome when I'm back at Australia, and that can happen for many reasons, but for me it's often happening when I become dehydrated and there's a much higher amount of salt coming in from constantly eating out. So let's then look at the other side of the coin, which is overhydration. And this is probably a term that you've only heard talked about with things like, say, marathon runners. So regularly during a marathon, someone will consume a huge amount of water, they're not taking in enough electrolytes, and they'll end up like passing out or even dying because they've overhydrated. They diluted all of their fluids so much that it's caused a problem. But in practice, I'd say it's much more common that this is happening in day-to-day life, not to the point that someone is dying, but to the point that people are taking in much more fluids than they need, or much more fluids than they need in comparison to the amount of electrolytes and the amount of food energy that they're taking in. And so let's say in example, I want you to imagine someone who is doing their best to be pretty healthy. And so they are trying to keep their calories low. And this could be like an intentional thing where they're actually or actively counting their calories, or it could be more of an unintentional thing with them choosing, say, more natural foods that are just lower in calories. This person could be having lots of green smoothies. They could be having lots of salad and steamed vegetables. They may have some fruit, but they're leaning more towards like above ground vegetables like kale and broccoli, or having low sugar fruits or fruits with very high water content. They may be having some meat or fish, but it's much more sparing. And when they do have it, they have it with a salad or some steamed vegetables or a vegetable soup, instead of having it with things like rice or bread or potatoes. And they may have some chocolate or some biscuits or some other bad foods in inverted commas of how they would refer to it, but it's only in these situations when their cravings have become a bit too much, and they're normally pretty good with keeping this stuff under control. And this person or these kinds of people are normally drinking large amounts of water. They are aiming for 1.5 or 2 liters of plain water a day. They're often having lots of herbal teas on top of this. And when I chat with them, more often than not, it's they're having herbal teas to try and heat themselves up because they have a tendency for being quite cold. So this is like a standard healthy eater. And there are a lot of people who fit this bill who are eating in a very similar way to this, who then show up in my practice as clients. And so like last time, let's have a look at the 3 components of proper hydration. So on the fluid side, they are taking in a very high amount of fluids. They get the fluids from the water, from the herbal teas, and also the fluids from the foods that they are eating that contain water or water content. So for example, like fruits and vegetables typically are like 90-95% water. So this is then more fluids that they have coming in. So with this kind of fluid intake, you would then need to have high amounts of food energy and high amounts of electrolytes to be coming in to match up to that water intake. But on the energy front, they're typically lacking. The foods that they're eating are naturally low in calories and they're eating it in small amounts. So the carbohydrates and the fat that they need to be coming in is then much lower. And this means that there's much lower amounts of this stuff both in the extracellular fluid, but more importantly, there's lower amounts inside the cell being turned into energy. On the electrolyte side of things, there's also a tendency for this to be low, at least for some of the electrolytes. Like people who are health conscious often avoid, say, salt like the plague. And so this is something that's not probably going to be occurring in many of the foods that they're eating. So their salt content or their salt intake could be on the lower side. A lot of the foods that they're also eating are pretty difficult to digest. So even if there is a high amount of, say, magnesium or potassium in kale, if you're having it raw in a smoothie, because you are not a ruminant animal, your ability to actually get these nutrients out is on the very low side of things. So while on paper most people would maybe think that this very healthy diet is high in electrolytes, in terms of how much this person is digesting and assimilating and getting out of this, it's probably on the lower side. And there is another reason for this, which I will touch on in a minute that explains this a bit more. But for now, let's just say that they are not getting in the electrolytes that they need. So in this case, you have a situation where you have a high amount of water coming in, but the food energy and then the electrolytes are on the low side. So the excessive water starts to flood the body. It's then diluting both the extracellular fluid as well as the internal environment within the cell. So when this water initially comes in, your cells start to take up that water. But with the then inadequate supply of the energy and the electrolytes, they aren't able to function properly. They're basically looking and saying the ratio of these three things are out and they can't function the way they should, they can't produce energy the way they should. So to remedy this situation, the cells basically just push water out and they want to get it out of the body. And so this causes then an urgent need to urinate, with the urine becoming much more clear or getting very close to being clear. And often like one urination is not enough, and so it takes just longer for your cells to try and bring things back into balance. So you'll find that people can often be urinating fairly frequently. And this could be once an hour. It could be in cases where people are going multiple times an hour. So in this case, the individual will do much better to be reducing their water intake and even to be aware of the foods that contain high amounts of water within them. So looking at how much they're eating soups, how much are they eating things like melon, how much are they having like salads and other things that have very high amounts of water content. But just lowering the water won't do very much if they then keep their energy intake at a low level and lower than what they need. So in addition to looking at the water side of things, they should also be including more calories. They should be going for much more like hearty and warming foods. And I suggest for clients like this that they're going for things that we associate as like being comfort foods or foods that are associated more with winter time. So I said that there was another reason that can mess with this, and I'd say that this applies whether we're talking about someone who is like following the standard Western diet or someone who is trying to be healthy, and this thing is stress. So stress has a huge impact on urination, and it can do this in a number of ways. So first, it affects the level of electrolytes in the body and where those electrolytes want to go. So under stress, magnesium is typically used up, and so it's used for a lot of the processes to deal with this stress, and this then creates less of the magnesium inside of your cells where you really need it. Through the release of certain hormones that are associated with stress, your body then typically starts to retain or hold on to sodium while at the same time excreting potassium. So considering that potassium and magnesium are both the major intracellular electrolytes, you now have them in lower supply for both of them. And so sodium is, as I just mentioned, is typically retained, But what starts to happen under times of stress is more of this sodium starts to make its way inside of the cell. So as I mentioned earlier, sodium is largely extracellular electrolyte, so it should be mostly on the outside of the cell. But under stress, more of this can start to move inside of the cell, and this higher sodium content inside of the cell starts to pull more water into the cell. The same thing can start to happen with calcium, with more of it entering the cell instead of staying in the extracellular fluids where it should really be. And that higher amounts of calcium within the cell can start to excite the cell, but despite the excitement, it prevents it from producing proper energy. And this then further impairs the cell's ability to produce energy and to bring things back into balance. Again, this is then side by side with having more water that's being sucked in because of the sodium. And so all of these things start to play havoc with how well the cell can actually function. And so this makes it more likely that the cells are going to want to get fluids out of the body. And this again leads to like urination that's clear, urgency to go with urination. Stress also has a direct impact on digestion. So when the body is stressed, it becomes concerned with getting you out of harm's way and becomes concerned with very short-sighted functions or very short-sighted things. Digestion is seen as a long-term project. So under moments of stress, it's not so important for you to digest your food. And this means that less resources are put into creating hydrochloric acid in the stomach or the enzymes from the pancreas that are needed to help with digestion and assimilation. Under stress, the blood moves from your digestive system, from your reproductive system, and moves to different parts of the body, normally to like bigger muscles as part of the fight and flight mechanism. And stress from an evolutionary perspective is meant to be short-lived, but in our lives today, this stress can be constant and ongoing. So this reduced digestion can then lead to lower amounts of food energy being absorbed, also less electrolytes coming in. And stress can come in many guises, but undereating in of itself can be stressful. So the person who is trying to be healthy in the earlier example, their food choices are actually creating a stress response on top of what other stresses they have in their life. Body temperature can very much link into this, and our body creates heat at the same time as creating cellular energy or ATP. So as part of those processes, we create heat. So if someone is not making much energy, they are going to have a colder body temperature. And for the clients that I see who are over-consuming water, who are under-consuming food, and who are urinating very frequently, one of the most common complaints alongside of this frequent urination is that they feel cold. And this can be feeling cold in their core, where they feel cold and wanting to rug up constantly, but it also can be like cold extremities. So things like cold hands, cold feet, cold tip of the nose. And part of the reason for this is when your body is under stress, it releases a number of hormones, and adrenaline is one of these hormones. And one of adrenaline's roles is as part of the fight and flight response. To make you best able to run or to fight, it shifts your blood flow and your nutrients to be coming to and going to your bigger muscles, to your heart and your brain, instead of to your periphery, like your hands and feet and nose. So accompanying frequency with urination and urination that's clear, clients will often also have cold hands or cold feet or cold tip of the nose. And this is actually one of the things that I get clients to pay attention to as they are making changes. And I ask them to notice what happens to their hands and their feet as they have less watery foods and they have more hearty meals. And over time, invariably, they start to notice that things are warming up, or that now for half an hour after a meal or for 2 hours after a meal, they're warm before it starts to go to being cold again. So in a general sense, those who have a weaker state of health, especially if this is the result of undereating or overexercising, their tolerance for water and for fluids is going to be much lower. They have lower amounts of food energy, and they have lower amounts of electrolytes, and they have a much tougher time of holding on to those electrolytes and having the electrolytes in the right place. And this is also then greatly affected by stress. So because of this whole picture, they have a much lower tolerance and ability to take in and to utilize fluids. So the question you're probably then asking is, how much water should you drink? And the question is actually not answered by me, but is answered by your body. So you should urinate every 3 to 4 hours, and it should be straw colored. This is the gauge for how much water or fluids you should drink, or how much food you should have that has a high water content. So this could mean that someone is drinking 500 mils a day. It could mean that someone's drinking 3 liters a day. But the urination should be the guide for what is the correct amount. So if you're urinating 3 or 4 times your whole waking hours, and that urine is of a darker color, you probably should be drinking more fluids. If you're urinating every 1 or 2 hours, and this urine is clear or nearly clear, then you probably need to be drinking less fluids. And I say probably in both of these cases, because as I mentioned, it's not just about the fluids. There are dietary factors that can also be changed because of the role that they play, and these definitely need to be thought about at the same time. For those that are drinking lots of fluids and are also peeing all the time, this may feel a little strange. In the beginning, you may become thirsty when you try and cut your water consumption, and it's not uncommon for people who are urinating a lot to comment that they are always thirsty. And this also links into the stress response. So think about a situation where you have to give a presentation in front of a large group of people. What often happens? People get a dry mouth, they get thirsty. While they're thirsty in this situation, it's not due to dehydration, but because of being nervous and as part of that stress response. Well, if you are constantly flooding your cells with water and you're under eating, then it's not surprising that you are then getting that stress response and you then get a similar reaction. Also, if you look at the Minnesota starvation experiment, something that I've done a podcast on before and I'll link to on the show notes, as these guys were eating less and their body weights were dropping, their fluid intake increased dramatically and their cravings for water and fluid increased dramatically. So for the first week of cutting down on fluids, you may notice that same response, and you may notice that you're always thirsty. And this is why urination is then a better guide as to how much you should drink, but with a little bit of time. So normally as little as 7-10 days, often shorter than that, the body then starts to shift and your thirst becomes a better indicator for genuine thirst. But in the beginning, it can lead you astray, and so you're better off using your urination more as a guide to start with. One thing I do want to mention as part of this is I don't want the pendulum to then swing too far in the other direction, where people become scared of water or they stop drinking water or fluids altogether. And while you should be going or aiming to be going every 3 to 4 hours, you should be doing this while trying to take in the maximum amount of fluids that allow this to happen. So for example, you could have someone who drinks 500 mils, you could have someone who drinks a liter, and they're still going the same amount of times. And in my mind, you should then be going for the higher amount of fluids because water and fluids are important for the body. And this is especially true if you are doing things that are very physical, so lots of exercise, or your job is a very physical job, if you're spending time in a very hot environment, if you have a history of kidney issues or recurrent urinary tract infections or that kind of thing. So what you want to be doing is finding the way that you can drink the maximum amount of fluids every 3 to 4 hours, and the maximum amount of fluids you can be drinking so that you are urinating every 3 to 4 hours. But this shouldn't be you totally erring on the side of barely drinking anything. And as I keep saying, if you do have a tendency towards frequent urination and are reducing your fluids, you should be looking at your food intake and other things in terms of how this can be altering and affecting the situation, because it's normally not just about reducing your fluids. And we don't necessarily need to drink fluids at equal intervals throughout the day, but we should again be listening to our body and paying attention to what our different patterns are. So for those who struggle with frequent urination or clear urination, they often have a tendency to have worse times of the day for drinking fluids, or it being more likely to create that problem where it's just going straight through them. So for some people, it's early in the morning. For others, it's in the afternoon. For others, it's like just before bed. And becoming aware of like when your bad time is or when your worst time is, and limiting or avoiding drinking at this time can be really helpful. So personally, I don't drink much in the first half of the day because it seems to just go straight through me. So having a big glass of water when I wake up, I know is often a bit of like health advice that most people have heard, but for me it isn't like a terrible idea. And I would say the same thing about me having some fresh juice or a smoothie in the morning, even something like porridge or fresh fruit, due to its high water content, is not great for me to have for breakfast. So my preference for breakfast is things like scrambled eggs, halloumi, pancakes, French toast, frittata. For me to add more carbs in, I'm actually better to include things like root vegetables. So potatoes or sweet potatoes, or if I am going to be having fruit, to be having fruits like bananas that have a much lower water content. And say for my mid-morning snack, I'm better to have things like dried fruit, so dates or sultanas or raisins or some figs with something like salty or savory. So it might be some cheese or some oatcakes or that kind of thing. And by lunchtime, I'm then like fine to eat and drink as I please. And so if I'm going to have a juice or a smoothie, then lunchtime or in the afternoon is when I'll have it, because I can then benefit from this without it just going straight through me, making me pee nonstop and making me really cold. And I can remember when I was studying nutrition that we were told that things like caffeinated drinks, so caffeinated tea and coffee, doesn't count towards your fluid content because it's a diuretic. So you should be still drinking 1.5 liters or 2 liters of plain water on top of these drinks. Well, this isn't actually correct. While these drinks do have a mild diuretic effect, they are still providing the body with the high amount of water. And this means that the net result of drinking these is providing the body with a lot of hydration. It may not be exactly the same amount as drinking plain water, but it's not too far off. So if you are drinking tea or coffee and think that this doesn't count toward your fluid intake, then you need to think again, because it does. And there may be reasons for people to be drinking less tea or coffee or to be reducing it altogether, but lack of hydration is not one of these reasons. So the final thing I want to comment on is nighttime urination. So waking up in the night to urinate once or multiple times is very common with clients. And it's something that's often associated with older people and is talked about as a natural part of getting older. And while I think it is common, it doesn't mean that it can't be corrected and that older people can't be sleeping through the night and not urinating. But it is something that I see a lot with younger clients as well. And many people in their 20s and 30s who are waking up once or multiple times a night to urinate. So it's not just an age thing. So why is this happening? So this links into, for me, an energy regulation problem. So during sleep, there is a lot of repair work that is going on. So your immune system at its highest. You are repairing organs and bones and tissue. You are breaking down and rebuilding cells. You are consolidating learning. And so your nervous system and your brain are involved. Like, despite the fact that you were lying down and you feel like you were doing nothing, there is a lot going on while you sleep. And these different processes require energy. So if someone is under eating during the day for the demands of their body, this then catches up with them at nighttime. And this can take many different guises in terms of how it disrupts someone's sleep. But if the body is using up all of its food energy and its electrolytes during the day and in the early hours of sleeping, at some point there is going to be too much water, too much fluids in comparison to these other substances. And so to bring the body back into balance, it wakes you up. you then go to the toilet and you then pee out a lot of this extra fluids, and hopefully that then resolves this issue. So one of the things that I suggest if people are having this as an issue is having a snack just before going to bed so they can bring in a little bit of extra energy, a final amount of electrolytes before going to sleep. This doesn't necessarily resolve everything, and obviously they need to be looking at what they're eating throughout the day, because some small snack before bed is not going to repair a day's worth of poor eating if someone's under eating, if they're having long gaps between their meals, but it can be something that is helpful to start with. I also find having people keeping some food on their nightstand can also be useful. So often when people wake up and they urinate, for some clients they have a real trouble getting back to sleep. For others, they wake up, they urinate, they get back to sleep, no trouble. For those who then have trouble getting back to sleep, having some food, having a little bit of energy come in can help them to get back to sleep. So often I'll suggest like keeping a banana or something like that next to their bed, and then them having it if they wake up. This isn't really resolving the situation. It is a band-aid, and we need to be then doing other work during the day and other work in terms of their health to repair the situation at its core. But at that stage, the most important thing is that they actually just get back to sleep. And so having them eat something that then allows that to happen is then really important. Stress can also really mess up this process. So the stress response within the body, it's hugely inefficient. It uses up masses of energy, because when you're in a life and death situation, which is how your body perceives it when you're under stress, then it's not the time for it to be thrifty. Like, you are better to use more energy than try and be conservative and then end up being some other animal's dinner. But if stress is consistent, then the energy that is being wasted rather than being used for long-term health starts to catch up with people. So at the point you then go to bed and your body is starting to do that repair work that it should be doing, we get the same situation as someone who is under eating. You're running out of food energy, you're running out of electrolytes, and you have an excess of diluted fluids within your body that then needs expelling. And I can personally testify to this recently. I've had some stuff going on in my personal life for the last couple of months. It has really just been a succession of one thing after another of like just totally unexpected and pretty horrible stuff going on. And while there are aspects of 2016 that have been amazing, it has been a real like relentless challenge. And so while my eating has been pretty constant throughout, stress has been playing a much bigger role for the last couple of months. And I am normally someone who sleeps really well. I never wake up to urinate, but it has been happening much more frequently recently. And I've also noticed that my sleep hasn't been as of good quality. And when things are working well, you shouldn't be waking up in the night to urinate. You produce a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, also known as arginine vasopressin, and this hormone reduces the urge to urinate, and is a hormone that increases at nighttime so that you can then make it through the night without needing to get up and urinate. So if you are waking up in the night like I have been recently, then it's because things are interfering with this hormone and undoubtedly lots of other hormones. And I really see the importance of sleep. If people aren't getting adequate sleep or the restoration process that are meant to be happening while someone's asleep, then this is a real problem. And it's why it's always the first thing I deal with if someone is struggling with sleep. So if they're coming to me and they've got this long list of symptoms, and if that list involves sleep, it's where I'll put a lot of my attention to start with. Or at least it'll be one of the most important symptoms that I will be looking at to be analyzing whether what we are doing is working, because I want people to be getting sleep where they're sleeping through the night, they're not waking up to urinate, they're not having trouble getting to sleep or waking in the night at other points even outside of urination. So making sure that that is happening is really important. So that is it for this week's episode on urination and fluid intake. Like, hopefully I've shared some insights or information that you didn't know about before, and that I've given you maybe some suggestions of things that you can try out and see how they work for you. As always, I will be back next week and I will be sitting down with another guest. Have a great week and I will catch you then.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.